The chief's daughter was forced to marry a white man as punishment, but his first touch changed everything. Before we start, don't forget to like the video and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. The sun hung low over Dust Creek, spilling golden light across the dusty settlement when the riders appeared. Heat shimmered off the ground, pressing down on a handful of weathered buildings lined along the square. Dogs barked, and children peeked from behind doorways before anxious mothers pulled them back inside. At the head of the small procession rode Seika Ironhand and Dasan Swiftwind, their expressions grim, their horses restless. Behind them walked a young woman, her wrists bound, her chin held high, despite the humiliation dragging at her steps. Aiyana Redbird, daughter of Chief Tall Bear, had grown up beneath the weight of her people's rules. At 24, she was admired for her skill with herbs, her proud beauty, and her fierce spirit. But now that same spirit had branded her a traitor. All because she had spoken kindly to a foreign trader, Clint Mercer, and traded herbs for tools. Harmless words twisted by gossip into sin. The tribe of Red Mesa whispered her name in shame, until the council declared her fate. She would be given to a white man, cast out from her people, and made an example of what defiance cost. Her heart pounded as the horses halted before the saloon. The townsfolk gathered, rough men, wary women, and curious eyes, hungry for spectacle. She could feel their stares on her, the dirt on her cheeks, the torn seam of her deerskin dress where rough hands had pulled too hard. Still, she refused to lower her head. Her father had not spoken in her defense. Her mother, Waya Moonfeather, had turned away when the ropes were tied. Abandoned, humiliated, but not broken. Among the crowd stood Elias Stronghawk, a man who rarely came into town. 38, worn by years of solitude, he carried the silence of a man who had lost more than most. Once he had ridden with the Union cavalry through smoke, through death, and though his body bore scars, the deepest wounds lay behind his eyes. He had tried once to build a life beyond war, a wife, Naya Willowheart, a son, Tobin, both buried when fever swept through. Since then, Elias kept to his ranch beyond the edge of town, working the hard land with only his horse Dustfire for company. He hadn't come to witness punishment just to collect a debt. But when he saw the procession, he stopped, leaning against a wooden post, his hat pulled low. His gaze locked on the proud woman in ropes, her wrists bound, her shoulders trembling, yet her spirit unyielding. Something inside him shifted. Anger, pity, maybe recognition, maybe. Then Chief Iron Oak raised his voice. "This woman is no longer of our people," he declared. "She is given over to the white man, to Elias Stronghawk." Elias's stomach tightened. He hadn't asked for this, hadn't asked for anyone. But before he could speak, the rope binding her wrists was shoved into his palm, rough and final. The crowd stared, waiting for him to assert ownership. Instead, Elias pulled his knife and sliced through the rope. The fibers snapped, leaving red welts on her skin. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. He said nothing, just turned untied Dustfire and held the reins toward her. Aiyana froze. Every instinct screamed to run. But where would she go? Her tribe had cast her out. Her name erased. All that remained was this man, her punishment. She hated him already, but the way he cut her bonds, silent, firm, without cruelty, stirred something small and dangerous inside her, a spark of hope. When she stumbled, trying to mount the horse, he lifted her easily. His hands were strong but gentle, releasing her as soon as she was steady, careful not to linger. She sat tall, fighting to hide her fear. They rode out in silence, The sun dipped behind the red horizon, stretching long shadows across the desert. Only the sound of hooves filled the space between them. Aiyana's thoughts churned. How long before he demanded what had been forced upon him? Would he treat her as punishment, or let her starve if she resisted? Elias's mind was no quieter. He had lived too long with ghosts to welcome another into his world. But when he looked at her, at the proud line of her jaw, the defiance trembling beneath her fear-respect stirred where he expected bitterness. By nightfall, they reached his cabin, a lonely shelter of logs and stone, standing against the endless wild. A place built for one man and haunted by silence. But tonight, that silence was about to change. Elias dismounted, tied Dustfire to the post, and pushed the door open. Inside, he said, his voice low and rough like a man who'd forgotten how to talk. Aiyana Redbird stepped in first, her bare feet meeting the cold wooden floor. The cabin smelled of smoke leather and faint traces of lamp oil. A small stove rested in one corner, a bed pressed against the wall, and a table with 2 chairs, simple, meant for one man, not 2. Elias set a bucket of water near her feet, then sank heavily into the chair beside the fire. He watched her from the corner of his eye, the way she folded her arms across her chest, trying to shield herself from his gaze, though he'd already looked too long. Her beauty unsettled him, the torn edge of her dress, the curve she couldn't hide, and the proud calm she fought to keep. Shame flickered through him for noticing it all. She stood stiff silent, her heartbeat loud in her ears. Every sound in that cabin seemed sharper, the pop of burning wood, the scrape of his boots on the floor. She didn't know what kind of man he was, or what he might demand before the night was over. Fear twisted in her gut, but she refused to show it. Elias leaned back, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the fire. He didn't know what he'd brought into his home, but one thing was certain: he wouldn't treat her like property. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. The silence stretched heavy between them, alive with unspoken thoughts. 2 strangers trapped by fate, both wondering if survival together was better than dying alone. The night air crept cold through the cracks in the logs. Aiyana stood close to the stove, rubbing her arms for warmth. Elias hadn't spoken since they entered. He sat with his boots planted firm, his broad shoulders bent under invisible weight. She studied him from the corner of her eye, questions clawing at her thoughts. Why him? Why had the council chosen this man? Did he even want her, or had he been punished too? At last Elias rose, pulled a blanket from the bed, and spread it across the floor near the stove. "You'll sleep here tonight," he said, his tone even but coarse from disuse. He didn't look at her. She'd expected him to claim the bed, but instead he rolled his coat into a pillow beside the blanket. Confusion and disbelief tangled in her chest. Punishment was supposed to mean shame, not distance. When he walked past her toward the door, she tensed. But he didn't touch her, he only stepped out. The boards on the porch creaked beneath his boots before fading into the dark. She waited, listening, half afraid he was circling back to trap her, but the sound that reached her ears was steady and rhythmic. An axe splitting wood. He was cutting more fuel for the fire. Slowly she sank down to the blanket, the glow of the flames flickering against the cabin walls. Exhaustion pulled at her, but fear kept her eyes open. When Elias returned, he stacked the wood by the door, washed his hands in the bucket, and glanced toward her. She lay curled by the fire, eyes open but heavy, clutching the blanket tight. He hesitated, then moved quietly to the bed, careful not to disturb her. He knew she was awake. He knew she didn't trust him. But he had no wish to force anything. Lying back, he stared up at the beams, listening to her uneven breathing, until sleep took them both. Morning broke, with thin light spilling through the shutters. Elias rose first, pulling on his boots in silence, his movements smooth from long habit. Aiyana stirred, but didn't move until she heard the door close behind him. She sat up slowly, the blanket slipping from her shoulders, and looked around in daylight for the first time. The place was bare, one bed, one chair, a few tools hung neatly on the wall. A home built for solitude, not company. Her thoughts tangled. Who was this man who spoke so little? Why had he been chosen, and why hadn't he treated her with the cruelty everyone expected? When Elias returned, he carried a pail of water from the well. Without a word, he set it down and placed a rough loaf of bread on the table. He broke a piece, handed it to her. She hesitated, suspicious, but hunger overruled pride. She ate slowly, her eyes on him. He watched long enough to see her take the food, then turned away to feed the fire. A few minutes later, he strapped on his gear and glanced toward her. "Come," he said simply. Aiyana hesitated for a heartbeat before stepping outside. The morning air bit at her skin, crisp and dry, carrying the scent of dust and sage. The land stretched endlessly before her, flat plains dotted with brittle shrubs, and far off a thin line of cattle penned against the horizon. Elias handed her a small tin pail. "Water trough," he muttered, nodding toward the animals. She understood. This wasn't affection. This was labor. She had been given to him not as a wife to be cherished, but as another set of hands to work the land. Still, as she trudged to the trough, water splashing over her bare feet, she realized he worked harder than she did. Never resting, never commanding, just doing. The day unfolded with the rhythm of chores, feeding livestock, hauling water, sweeping the cabin floor. Every muscle in her body burned with exhaustion, but Aiyana Redbird held her head high. Elias Stronghawk spoke little, his words clipped and practical. And yet once, just once, she caught his eyes on her as she bent over the trough, the torn seam of her dress slipping open at her chest. He looked away instantly, his jaw tightening, shame shadowing his face. That simple restraint left her more unsettled than cruelty ever could. That night, as the fire glowed low, Aiyana sat near the stove, stitching the torn fabric with a bent needle she'd found in a wooden box. Her fingers shook with fatigue. Elias sat across from her, silent, staring into the flames. After a long pause, his voice broke the quiet. "Why did they send you?" Her head snapped up. She hadn't expected him to ask. For a moment she considered lying, but what was the point? "They said I betrayed them," she answered evenly. "I spoke to a traitor, that's all." Her voice stayed steady, but her throat burned with the memory. Elias's eyes narrowed, though he said nothing. His jaw flexed once, as if wrestling something down inside himself. In that flicker of silence, she saw it, the disbelief in his gaze. He didn't think she deserved this. For the first time since her exile began, fear wasn't the only thing in her chest. Something fragile stirred beneath it. He was still a stranger, still the man she'd been handed to, like property, but perhaps not the monster her tribe had hoped would break her. When the fire dimmed, Elias laid his coat across the floor again. She frowned in confusion. "The bed's yours," he said simply. His tone carried no demand, no edge, just quiet certainty. Aiyana turned away, lying down with her back to him, her heart pounding too loud to sleep. Elias stretched out on the floor, staring into the dark. He wondered why the council had chosen him, why he hadn't refused, and why this woman meant to shame him had already begun to matter. By the third morning, the sound of boots against the wood woke her. Elias had risen before dawn, and the smell of smoke told her he'd already started the fire. She sat up slowly, her body sore from work, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. When he came through the door carrying a sack of oats, the cabin filled with the faint scent of grain and ash. He said nothing, just set it down and placed rough bread on the table. They ate in silence. She answered only when he gave instructions, still unsure what to make of this man who spoke so little, who lived without comfort or warmth. Why had the tribe of Red Mesa chosen him? He had asked himself the same question. Maybe because he lived far enough out that no one cared what became of her. Maybe because he had no one left to protest. Maybe because he was already too broken to fight. After breakfast, he opened a trunk and pulled out a wool shawl. For the cold, he said not, meeting her eyes. She hesitated before taking it. The weight of it felt strange, but warm, almost kind. They walked to the corral together under the first light of morning. The livestock stirred, restless. Elias showed her how to scatter the oats. She fumbled, spilling more than she poured. He didn't scold her, just took the bucket, refilled it, and nodded for her to try again. The hours passed beneath the high desert sun. They hauled water, fixed the fence, stacked wood. Aiyana's arms ached, but she refused to ask for rest. She wanted him to see she wasn't weak. At midday, they sat by the well. Her breathing was shallow. Elias handed her a canteen, his rough fingers brushing hers. She stiffened, but didn't pull away. Back in town, whispers had already begun why Elias Stronghawk had accepted a woman as punishment, and how long she'd last out there on his lonely ranch. Some said he'd use her till she broke, others said he'd leave her to starve. Neither of them yet knew how wrong the town was. Some said he'd starve her out there. Aiyana Redbird wondered if Elias Stronghawk had heard the whispers, if he even cared. The thought slipped from her lips before she could stop it. "Do they talk about us?" she asked quietly, her eyes fixed on the dirt. Elias's jaw tightened. "They always do." He didn't add more, but she heard the weariness under his words, the kind that only came from living too long under judgment. It struck her then that he carried the same burden she did, both cast aside, both condemned by voices that had never cared to know the truth. For the first time, she felt a faint bridge between them. That night the cabin flickered with firelight. Aiyana sat at the table, mending the seam of her torn dress with steadier hands than before. Across from her, Elias sharpened his knife, the rasp of steel against stone steady and rhythmic. Without looking up, he spoke. "You can leave if you want. Go back to them. No one's holding you here." Her needle froze mid-stitch. "Go back," she whispered. The words hung heavy in the space between them. She thought of the council's cold faces, the shame branded into her name. Even if she returned, she'd be an outcast. Her voice was firm when she finally said, "I have no tribe anymore." Elias looked up. Then his face shadowed by the glow of the fire. He nodded once, slow and quiet. He didn't press her. He didn't need to. He already knew she hadn't just been taken from her people. She'd been abandoned by them. When the fire burned low, he spread his coat across the floor once again. She hesitated, watching him. "Why do you keep doing that?" she asked softly. He shrugged. "Because it was yours before it was mine." She turned away, heart racing. The distance between them still stood, but it no longer felt cold. That night, for the first time since the ropes had been cut from her wrists, she slept without fear of what dawn might bring. The next morning felt different. The silence inside the cabin no longer carried that sharp edge of suspicion. Aiyana woke, wrapped in the blanket he'd left her, the bed still warm from her own body. His coat was folded neatly at the foot of it. Outside, she heard the steady rhythm of work, the scrape of a shovel, the soft grunt of effort. She rose, her muscles sore, but her chest strangely calm. When she stepped outside, the chill hit her lungs. Elias stood by the barn hammer in hand, fixing a broken hinge. He glanced up briefly, then went back to work. She noticed something new, the stiffness in his left shoulder, the faint limp in his step. His scars weren't only carved in memory. The war had taken more from him than peace of mind. She found herself speaking before she could stop. "They chose you." Why? Elias paused mid-swing. The hammer stilled in his hand. He exhaled slowly, eyes dark. "Because I live far enough out that no one asks questions. Because I've buried more than most. They figured I wouldn't care what happened to anyone else." His voice was even, but the bitterness ran deep. Aiyana stood quietly, absorbing his words. They confirmed what she'd already guessed, but something inside her shifted. The man they'd chosen to break her spirit wasn't cruel, just broken in his own way. Later they worked side by side again. Elias showed her how to gather eggs from the few hens behind the cabin. She reached into the nests carefully, hissing, when one of the birds pecked her fingers. Elias smirked barely, but it was there, a fleeting crack in his stone face. Then it vanished, as if he'd remembered he'd forgotten how to smile. When she held out the eggs to him, her pride was unmistakable. She'd done something right, something useful. By midday, they were mending the corral under the burning sun. Sweat dampened her torn dress, the fabric clinging to her skin. Elias tried not to notice, but his eyes betrayed him once. And she caught it. For a moment, her breath caught too, a tension she didn't understand tightening in the air between them. But Elias Stronghawk turned away sharply, driving a nail into the plank with more force than needed, as though punishing himself for noticing her at all. By evening, the fire glowed bright inside the cabin. Aiyana Redbird sat close to it, sewing with steadier hands than before, the torn edge of her dress mending under the dim light. Elias sat nearby, cleaning his rifle. The motions were practiced automatic, but his mind was somewhere far away. She wanted to ask about his limp, the scars she'd glimpsed, the ghosts that shadowed his eyes, but her throat locked around the words. Instead, she whispered the question that had haunted her since the day the council bound her wrists. "What will you do with me?" The cabin stilled. Elias set the rifle aside, his gaze finally meeting hers. His eyes were dark, worn, but not cruel. "Nothing you don't choose," he said simply. The fire cracked, filling the silence that followed. Aiyana stared at him, searching his face for a lie. But there was none. His words rang plain and steady, and in that quiet she felt something she hadn't known in weeks' belief. That night, while the wind howled outside and the shutters rattled against the cold, Elias again laid his coat on the floor. Aiyana sat on the bed, watching him. "Why don't you take it?" she asked. Suddenly, her voice low but firm. "The bed, the right they gave you." His shoulders stiffened. He turned, meeting her eyes. "Because I never asked for you," he said, "and because you're not punishment to me no matter what they said." Her chest tightened. She lay back slowly, thoughts racing. Fear had ruled every heartbeat since her exile, but tonight something else began to stir. Not safety, not trust, but the fragile spark of it. As he settled onto the floor, the sound of the fire softened. For the first time, she closed her eyes without bracing for what the dark might bring. In the quiet, both found unspoken answers. The town's gossip, why Elias had taken her, why he gave her the bed, why he hadn't touched her, didn't matter anymore. Each small moment revealed more of who they were, the man beneath his silence, the woman who refused to bow. Days slipped into rhythm. The sun rose and work began. Elias tended the animals, mended fences, chopped wood. Aiyana followed first uncertainly, then with purpose. On the 5th morning she woke before him and stoked the stove herself. The smell of burning oak filled the cabin when he returned with a pail of water. She looked away, hiding her small pride, but he noticed. He set the pail down, gave a single quiet nod, and for once that was enough. Both carried unspoken questions. What would she become in this place? Servant wife, something else entirely. And for him the question cut deeper. Why hadn't he sent her back, refused her, told the council to find another man? Why did her presence feel less like a burden and more like something he couldn't name? After breakfast, he brought her to the corral. One of the mules was restless, stamping and jerking the line. "Hold the rope steady," he said, passing it to her. The animal's strength nearly pulled her off balance. Elias stepped behind her, one hand gripping her wrist, his voice low and sure. "Don't fight him. Steady now, don't let go." The mule kicked once, dust rising around them. Her pulse hammered, but Elias's grip steadied her. He didn't take over, he showed her how to stand her ground. When the mule finally calmed, Aiyana's breath came fast, sweat glinting along her collarbone. Elias released her hand slowly, his touch lingering just a second too long. The moment stretched unspoken, undeniable. Later, under the hot sun, they worked side by side, hauling hay. She stumbled once, the bundle too heavy, and Elias silently took the larger load. His limp was more pronounced now, his steps uneven but uncomplaining. "You're hurt," she said quietly. "Your leg, it pains you." He paused, wiped the sweat from his brow. "Shrapnel," he said. "The war took more than men." He didn't elaborate. But she saw the truth in his eyes. His silence wasn't emptiness. It was grief carried far too long. For the first time, Aiyana Redbird felt something other than fear toward Elias Stronghawk. A flicker of empathy she didn't expect. By dusk, the day's work was done, and the two of them sat before the fire once more. Aiyana mended her worn dress with sore, trembling fingers, though the fabric was beyond saving. Elias watched in silence for a long while, before standing and opening a wooden trunk at the foot of his bed. He pulled out a folded flannel shirt, old but clean. The pattern faded from years of use, and held it out awkwardly. "It'll fit better than that," he said. Her hands stilled around the needle. Accepting it meant admitting something between them had shifted. Refusing would be nothing but pride, and pride was a luxury she no longer owned. Slowly she reached out and took it from him. "Why give this to me?" she asked softly, eyes searching his face. "Because you deserve more than rags," he answered, voice rough but sincere. There was no mockery in his tone, only truth. She changed into the shirt before lying down, the fabric hanging loose, but decent, covering what the torn deerskin could not. Elias turned away, respectful of her privacy, something she hadn't known since her capture. As she settled under the blanket, the faint scent of him clung to the cloth, wood smoke, leather, the dry earth outside. It both unsettled and comforted her, grounding her in this strange new life. When the fire dimmed, she whispered into the quiet, more to herself than to him. "I was meant to be destroyed." His voice came from the floor, low and steady. "Not here." For the first time since the tribe of Red Mesa had cast her out, something inside her loosened. The questions that had haunted her, whether she was safe, Whether he'd one day break her remained. But little by little, Elias Stronghawk was proving that her punishment might not be the end of her story. It could be the beginning of something neither of them had expected. The next morning, Aiyana woke to the scent of smoke and leather clinging faintly to the borrowed shirt. It was too big, the sleeves rolled roughly to her wrists, but it gave her something she hadn't felt since that terrible day, dignity. She rose before Elias, stoked the stove, and set water to boil. Her movements were clumsy, but determined, each one a quiet echo of what she had watched him do over the past days. When Elias came in from the cold, his arms full of chopped wood, he paused. She was working by the stove, hair loose around her shoulders, face flushed from the firelight. He said nothing, but a flicker crossed his expression, a man unaccustomed to anyone tending his home. Breakfast was simple bread and oats, but she had made it for him, and he ate without a word of complaint. The silence between them lingered, but it no longer felt like a barrier. It was beginning to sound like an unspoken language neither of them had learned yet. Aiyana watched him as he moved about the cabin, noticing again the stiffness in his shoulder and the way his limp worsened when he carried weight. The council had called her punishment, but the longer she stayed, the more she saw Elias Stronghawk was a man already living his own sentence. That day's labor was harder. Elias decided to reinforce the corral after the mule's wild behavior. He carried the heavy posts himself, jaw clenched tight, the pain in his leg barely masked. Without being told, Aiyana stepped forward, grabbing one end of a beam and staggering beneath its weight. He turned sharply to take it from her, but she shook her head. "I can." Her arms trembled, but she refused to stop until they dropped the beam by the fence. Elias gave a small nod, not quite praise, but something close. They worked beneath a clear sky, digging holes, setting posts, hammering nails. When the hammer slipped and smashed her thumb, Aiyana gasped, clutching her hand as tears of pain welled up. Before she could pull away, Elias caught her hand gently, his rough fingers steadying hers as he examined the swelling. His thumb brushed the skin, careful but firm. "Not broken," he said, voice calm as ever. Her breath hitched. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then she pulled back quickly, her heart pounding harder than the pain itself. By late afternoon, every muscle in her body screamed. Sweat clung to her skin, the flannel sticking to her curves. When she caught Elias glancing her way, she flushed. He turned away, jaw tight, but not before she saw the truth flicker across his face. She was no longer just a stranger, forced upon him. She was becoming something more dangerous, someone he wanted. And that realization unsettled him more than war ever had. Back inside, the quiet returned. Aiyana sat by the fire, her thumb wrapped with a strip of cloth he'd cut for her. Elias mended a broken stirrup at the table, the soft sound of his tools filling the space between them. Finally, she looked up and broke the silence. "You said you never asked for me, Aiyana," Redbird murmured, her eyes fixed on the flames. "But you didn't refuse either." Elias Stronghawk set the strip of leather down, jaw tightening. He didn't look at her right away. "If I had refused," he said at last, voice low, "they'd have given you to someone else. Someone who wouldn't have stopped at cutting the rope." When his gaze finally met hers, it held steady, firm, unflinching. "I figured you'd have better odds here." The words struck deeper than she expected. Her mind flashed back to the crowd, the hungry looks, the men waiting for a show. She'd hated him that day for taking her, but now she saw the truth: he might have saved her life. Her fingers clenched around the fabric of the shirt she wore, shame and gratitude twisting inside her chest in equal measure. The fire burned low, its light flickering over his worn features. Elias leaned back, exhaustion softening his shoulders. Aiyana studied him quietly, curiosity overcoming fear. "The war," she asked softly. "You fought in it." His eyes darkened. He nodded once. "Cavalry. Rode through places most men wouldn't. Lost more than I can count. Came home with a leg that won't work right, and a head that won't stay quiet." His tone was flat, but the weight behind it was heavy. "And your family?" she asked, before she could stop herself. His hands stilled on the chair's arms. "Fever took them," he said. "My wife, my boy. Buried them myself out back." The silence that followed was thick and aching. Aiyana's throat tightened, but she said nothing, knowing she had pressed close to a wound that still bled. When he finally stood to lay his coat on the floor, again she spoke quietly. "Why do you keep giving me the bed?" Elias paused, looking at her in the dim light. His voice came slow, deliberate. "Because it's the only thing in this cabin that still feels like it belongs to someone else. And I don't take what isn't mine." The words landed like a weight in her chest. She lay back the fabric of his shirt, clinging to her skin, the blanket heavy over her shoulders. Elias stretched out on the floorboards, his body stiff against the cold. As she turned toward the fire, her thoughts churned. Why had the tribe of Red Mesa chosen him? Was it because he lived alone? Or because they knew his silence, his scars, his brokenness? And why did it matter to her now when only days ago she had prayed to escape him, outside the wind pressed against the walls? Her fear had changed shape. She no longer feared what he might do to her, but what she might feel if he kept protecting her without ever asking for anything in return. That night, while Elias drifted into uneasy sleep, Aiyana lay awake, staring into the firelight. She had been given to him to be humiliated, to be broken, but instead, day by day, that punishment was becoming something else. Against her will, she was being rebuilt. And she didn't yet know what to do with that. By morning, the weight of their talk still lingered. Aiyana rose slowly, her gaze settling on Elias as he sat at the table mending a torn leather strap. His hands looked too old for his age, worn from war weather and solitude. The fire had burned down to embers, and the chill of dawn crept in. She thought of his words about burying his wife and son, about never taking what wasn't his. It unsettled her not with fear, but with something sharp and unfamiliar. Why did his restraint matter to her so much? Elias noticed her eyes on him, though he didn't look up. "We'll ride out today," he said, his tone steady as ever. "Supplies are low. Town's half a day's ride." At the mention of town, her stomach tightened. The memory of the crowd, the stares, the whispers still burned in her chest. "And if they see me?" she asked quietly. He looked up, then gaze steady. "They'll see you with me." He didn't have to say more. His meaning was clear. No one would touch her under his watch. By mid-morning, they rode out together. Elias in the saddle, shoulders broad, posture straight, despite his limp. Aiyana sat behind him, arms around his waist for balance, her cheek brushing the back of his coat. The wind stung her face, the desert stretching endless and harsh. She tried not to think of the settlement ahead, the judgment waiting there, but her mind betrayed her, focusing instead on the steady rhythm of his breathing, the scar that crossed his hand as it held the reins. When they finally reached Dust Creek, the reaction was immediate. Heads turned. Whispers rose. A woman near the saloon muttered under her breath. Every eye followed them. But for the first time, Aiyana didn't lower her head. She rode beside him not as property, but as someone under his protection. And that somehow felt dangerously close to freedom. A man by the saloon spat into the dust, his eyes dragging over Aiyana Redbird, with something sharp, and ugly. She stiffened her nails, pressing lightly into Elias Stronghawk's coat. He felt it said nothing, only guided Dustfire forward, his silence heavier than any threat. Inside Jed Hawkins's general store, the air smelled of flour, old wood, and coffee. Elias gathered what they needed: salt beans, tobacco, a sack of oats. Aiyana stayed close, chin high even as her stomach knotted. The shopkeeper's eyes kept flicking toward her. Finally, he muttered under his breath that her Elias's shoulders tensed. "She's with me," he said flatly. That was all. The man didn't ask again. Outside, as Elias secured the supplies to Dustfire's saddle, Aiyana saw two riders lounging by the well, Hank Dobbs and Cole Barrett, and Cole. Their smirks were slow and deliberate, eyes crawling over her, lingering on the shirt she wore, his shirt. Elias followed her gaze, his jaw hardening. He stepped forward until his shadow fell over her. "Mount up," he said quietly. She obeyed, without question. The riders caught Elias's stare, and whatever they'd meant to say died in their throats. They looked away. No words needed. The message was clear enough. The ride home was slow, weighed down by supplies, and the kind of silence that wasn't empty. It was full. Aiyana's mind churned. She'd felt the sting of those stares again, the shame pressing like a brand on her skin. But this time she'd also felt something else, his quiet shield, his refusal to let their cruelty touch her. Back at the cabin, she carried what she could inside, refusing to let him shoulder everything, even as his limp worsened. When the work was done, Elias dropped into his chair by the fire, the exhaustion etched deep into his frame. She hesitated, then sat across from him. "They hate me," she said finally, voice flat. He looked up, studying her face in the flickering light. "They don't matter. They do," she pressed. "My people say I betrayed them. Yours look at me like filth. Everywhere I go, I'm nothing." Something in him snapped. His voice rose low but sharp. "You're not nothing." The words startled them both. He exhaled, steadying himself. "You're here. You work. You live. That's more than most." She stared at him, breath-catching. He hadn't said it for her alone. He'd said it for himself. She saw it in his eyes, the same weight she carried, the same quiet defiance against being judged and forgotten. That night she cooked a simple stew of beans and herbs she'd gathered. They ate in silence, but something in the air had changed, less distance, more understanding. When the bowls were empty, Elias leaned back, fatigue softening the hard lines of his face. Aiyana's pulse quickened, with a question that had burned in her chest for days. "Why haven't you touched me?" she asked suddenly. The cabin fell still. Elias's eyes opened slowly, meeting hers. His voice was rough but steady. "Because I won't be the chain they put on you, not after what they did." Her throat tightened. She'd expected cold indifference, not this kind of restraint, not respect. She rose her steps, uncertain but deliberate. He didn't move, only watched her approach, his breathing deepening with every inch she closed. She stopped before him, the firelight catching in her eyes. "Then let me choose," she whispered. For a heartbeat, he didn't move. His jaw flexed, hands gripping the arms of the chair as though he could anchor himself there. But when she reached for his hand, hesitant, trembling, he finally let go. His fingers curled around hers, rough and warm. Slowly he stood, towering over her, but giving her space to retreat. She didn't. When he leaned down, his lips brushed hers, soft at first, questioning. Her breath hitched, but she didn't pull away. The kiss deepened, slow and searching, years of silence and pain breaking into something raw and new. His hand came up to her cheek, calloused, but careful. She pressed closer, her heartbeat matching his. For the first time since her exile began, her body wasn't something taken, it was something given. They broke apart only when the fire cracked beside them, loud and sharp, pulling them both back to breath. Elias Stronghawk stepped back, his breath uneven, the conflict clear in his eyes. "This changes things," he said quietly. Aiyana Redbird's voice trembled, but her words were steady. "It already has." That night, as the fire crackled low in the hearth, she did not sleep alone. She lay beside him, her back to his chest, her heartbeat thudding in her ears. His arm was slow to settle across her waist, hesitant, as if unsure of the new ground they had just tread. Neither of them spoke. The questions that had haunted their first nights, the fears of what he might demand whether she could survive this punishment, no longer lingered in the same way. Those who had wondered why he'd kept his distance, why he hadn't claimed her as his own, would find their answer now. He hadn't been waiting for the council's decree. He had been waiting for her choice. And in the quiet of the cabin with the fire flickering low, Aiyana knew she had made it. The morning after their first kiss was heavier than the ones before. Elias rose early, as he always did, but his movements were slower, burdened by something they hadn't yet named. Aiyana woke to find the fire already stoked, the faint smell of coffee drifting through the cabin. For the first time since her exile, she didn't feel dread when her eyes opened. Instead, there was a strange flutter in her chest, a memory of his hand at her waist, his lips soft against hers. It unsettled her in a way her punishment never had. Elias stood by the door, fastening his suspenders, his eyes avoiding hers. He hadn't asked for her to stay in his bed, but when she had chosen to, he hadn't pulled away. Now the space between them was uncharted, new, uncertain. He cleared his throat. "Fence needs checking," he said. "You can come or stay." His voice was flat, but she caught the hesitation in it. He wasn't used to explaining himself, to accounting for someone else's choice. She rose, pulling his flannel shirt tighter around her body. "I'll come," she replied, her voice soft but steady. Outside, the air was crisp, the desert morning stretching wide before them. The sky was pale blue, thin clouds drifting slowly across it. They walked side by side toward the corral. Their steps matched, though neither of them had spoken of it. Elias worked methodically, checking posts, tightening wire. Aiyana followed, watching, learning, handing him tools when he motioned for them. She noticed how his limp grew sharper as the hours passed, how his breath became heavier with each movement. Finally, she couldn't hold back the question that had been lingering in her mind since she first saw him struggle. Does it always hurt? Elias didn't look up as he drove a nail into place. Most days, he said, some worse than others. She stood quiet, chewing on the inside of her cheek. His pain wasn't something he volunteered to share, and she sensed it wasn't just his leg that ached, it was the weight of everything he'd lost, everything he'd buried. She wanted to ask more about his wife, his son. The grave she suspected was behind the cabin, but she held back, afraid of shattering the fragile trust that was growing between them. By midday, they paused. Elias leaned against the fence, his hat pulled low over his eyes. Aiyana sat on the ground nearby, her knees drawn up to her chest. The shirt clung to her damp skin from the heat of the sun, and her hair fell loosely over her shoulders. She caught him looking at her, quickly turning his gaze away. For a man who had spent so many years alone, the presence of another body, her body, was both comfort and temptation. Elias clenched his jaw, trying to steady the turmoil inside. Back at the cabin, Aiyana cooked with the herbs she had gathered a simple broth that carried more flavor than the plain meals before. Elias ate in silence, but when the bowl was empty, he gave a small nod. "Better than mine," he said, his tone the closest to praise she had received from him. Warmth spread through her chest, a fragile pride that softened the lingering resentment. That night, as the fire cast long shadows across the cabin walls, Aiyana sat at the table, mending her dress again. Elias sharpened his knife nearby, the scrape of steel against stone steady. Finally, Aiyana broke the silence. "What will happen when my people come for me?" Elias paused, his eyes lifting to hers. His gaze was hard, unreadable. "Do you want them to?" The question caught her off guard. She thought of her father's face when the council had tied her wrists the way no one had spoken in her defense. The shame burned in her chest, but so did the anger. "No," she said, her voice low but firm. "I'm no longer theirs." Elias set the knife aside. "Then they won't take you." She studied him, searching his face for something she couldn't name. "You'd stand against them." His voice was steady, unshaken. "Yes, I've stood against worse." "Elias Stronghawk," said his words, cutting through the tension like a knife. The declaration hit Aiyana Redbird harder than she expected. She realized then that he wasn't just protecting her. He was ready to claim the choice she had made to stay. For the first time, she felt something more than safety. She felt as though she belonged. Later that night, when the fire burned low, she moved toward the bed. Elias laid his coat on the floor, as he always did, but this time she paused. "You don't have to," she said softly, her voice laced with uncertainty. He froze, his hands stilling on the coat. His eyes met hers, dark with something unreadable. "Aiyana," he said her name quietly, his breath uneven. She stepped closer, her heart pounding in her chest. "I chose before. I choose again." Elias's restraint shattered. The coat fell from his hands as he reached for her. His body was tense, but when her hand found his, their lips met again, this time deeper. No hesitation, only the hunger of something long denied. He pulled her close, his hands resting gently on her waist. Her chest pressed against his, and the shirt she wore clung to her skin in ways that left little to the imagination. But there was no shame in it, not anymore. For the first time since her exile, her body wasn't a symbol of disgrace. It was hers freely given. When they finally pulled apart, their foreheads touched, and Elias's voice was rough, unsteady. "This isn't what they meant for you." Aiyana's eyes shone in the firelight. "No," she whispered. "It's better." That night they lay together, the cabin no longer divided by a coat and a bed. Elias's arm wrapped tightly around her waist, his breathing steady against her hair. She rested against him, and for the first time her fear was replaced by something she hadn't thought possible. Peace. The questions that had gnawed at her, the fear that Elias would treat her as nothing more than property, that she would never belong again, were now being answered. Not in words, but in gestures, in the slow breaking of silence. And though the thought of her tribe returning still lingered in the back of her mind, Aiyana knew with certainty that she was no longer a woman cast off in disgrace. She was a woman who had chosen, and Elias was the man who had given her that choice. The desert night outside was silent, the endless stretch of dark nothing but a reminder of the life she'd left behind. But inside the cabin, something new had begun. The morning after she had woken in his arms felt different than any before. The fire in the stove had burned down to faint embers, and the air was cool, but Aiyana didn't shiver. She woke, pressed against Elias's chest, his arm heavy across her waist, his steady breath warming her shoulder. For a brief moment, she lay still, eyes closed, her heart beating steady in a way it hadn't since before her people had bound her wrists. Then reality pressed in what would come next. What if the council decided her punishment was over, or worse, if they demanded her return? Elias stirred, loosening his grip as he woke. He blinked against the light slipping through the shutters. His expression was guarded as he realized how close she was. He shifted back, sitting on the edge of the bed, rubbing his face with his hands. He was a man not used to being held, not used to waking with another body pressed against his. "Chores won't wait," he said quietly, his tone flat, though his eyes lingered on her just a moment longer than before. The day began like the others with hard work. They hauled water-scattered feed, checked the livestock. But something had changed in the rhythm of it all. When Aiyana passed him tools, her fingers brushed his hand just a little longer than necessary. When Elias guided her at the trough, his hand stayed on hers. Just a fraction too long. The work went on, but beneath it, something unspoken shifted between them. By noon, dark clouds gathered in the sky, heavy with the promise of a storm. Elias paused in the field, looking westward. Dust shifted in the wind, and with it came riders. Aiyana followed his gaze, her breath catching. Men on horseback wearing the feathers of her people approached. Her stomach clenched. She knew why they had come. The riders pulled up near the corral. One of them, an older man with graying hair, called out in the language Aiyana knew well. "The punishment is done," he said. "You will return with us." His eyes were hard, but Aiyana saw the weight of duty beneath them. Elias stepped forward, his body blocking their view of her. "She stays here," he said, his voice calm, unwavering. The men shifted on their horses, their hands moving toward their weapons. She was given his punishment, not his wife. "You have no right to keep her." Elias's jaw tightened. Elias Stronghawk had faced down armed men before, in places where survival was a gamble, and he wasn't about to falter now. "She has a right," he said, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "She chooses." Aiyana Redbird's heart hammered, as all eyes fell on her. This was the moment no one had prepared her for. She remembered the faces of the tribe of Red Mesa, her father's silence, the whispers of betrayal that had followed her. She remembered the humiliation of being handed to Elias Stronghawk. And she remembered the quiet moments in the cabin, his restraint, the firelight, the way he had cut her bonds without claiming her, the way he had let her decide. Slowly she stepped forward, her chin raised high, her voice strong despite the tremor in her chest. "I will not go back." She declared her words clear and unwavering. "I was not guilty then, and I am not guilty now. I stay here." The riders exchanged uneasy glances. The older man, his hair streaked with gray, clenched his jaw, but didn't press further. He spat into the dirt, his expression one of disdain, and turned his horse. "Then you're no longer one of us," he said, his voice heavy with finality. The others followed their hooves, kicking up dust as they rode off into the desert, fading into the horizon. The silence that followed their departure felt thick and heavy. Aiyana Redbird's hands shook, though she forced herself to remain calm. Elias turned to her slowly, his eyes searching hers. "You meant it," he said, his voice rough, almost more of a statement than a question. She met his gaze, unwavering. "I did." The rest of the day passed in quiet labor, but the weight of her words lingered in the air. As they worked on the mended fence side by side, Their shoulders brushed occasionally, each touch heavier than just shared work. When evening fell, Elias cooked beans over the fire, his movements slower, more thoughtful than usual. Aiyana watched him, her chest tight with words she hadn't yet spoken. After supper, she broke the silence. "They won't come back for me," she said softly, her voice carrying a weight of finality. "No," Elias replied, his voice low and final. "Then this is my home now," she whispered, almost as if testing the truth of it. Elias looked at her across the fire, his eyes shadowed but steady. "If you want it." She moved closer, kneeling beside him, her hand reaching for his. Their fingers intertwined, her hand fitting perfectly with his rough, scarred palm. "I want it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The firelight flickered across their faces as Elias leaned in, his forehead resting gently against hers. His lips found hers again, slow, deep, no hesitation this time. She pressed closer, her breath uneven, her body yielding to him as her hand rested against his chest. He kissed her with the certainty of a man who had lost everything, but was daring to claim life again. When they finally pulled apart, their foreheads still touching Aiyana, Redbird spoke softly. "You're not my punishment," she said, her voice steady in the quiet. "You are my choice." Elias's throat tightened. He drew her close, his hands steady on the back of her head. "And you know what they gave me?" he whispered. "What you—" He replied, simply, the weight of it settling in her chest. That night they lay together, without distance. His arm wrapped firmly around her, her head resting against his chest, the fire crackling low beside them. The silence that had once separated them had transformed into something new. Peace. Belonging. The fragile beginning of something they had never expected to find. The questions that had loomed since the start, whether she would survive, whether he would take what was forced upon him, whether her exile would break her, were answered now in the simplest and most certain way. Aiyana Redbird had chosen, and Elias Stronghawk had accepted. Not as punishment, not as shame, but as love. As the desert wind whispered against the cabin walls, Elias called her, and Aiyana Redbird lay with him, no longer captor and captive, no longer defined by the weight of others' decisions. They were man and woman, bound not by decree, but by the simple defiant act of staying. The story ended as it was always meant to, not with chains or exile, but with two people who had endured punishment and found instead a home in each other. And this time, there would be no taking it back.